So who is excited about CSS Grid? Yeah. I am incredibly excited about it, and not just because it makes writing code for layouts way easier, which it totally does, but also because it fundamentally changes what we can do with page layout in web design. And I think it's one of these changes that comes along about once every 10 years that is kind of career-altering type changes to the medium that we are working in. And that makes me incredibly excited. As a designer, as an artist, as a person who's worked in other mediums, I'm constantly fascinated with understanding this work as an artistic medium and seeing where it is that we're going on kind of a long arc of history. And in order to really understand that, I frequently think about these other mediums like film. These are stills from the first commercial film ever. It came out in 1896 called The Kiss. 18 seconds long. And in this film, these two actors, they pose for a kiss, and then they kind of reset. He twiddles his mustache, and then they pose for another kiss. It's like they didn't quite realize that it was a film. They understood photography, and they were acting like they were having their photograph taken. I find that fascinating. There's so many things about the web that we still don't quite understand. You fast forward 80 years, and you get to one of my favorite TV shows as a child, Little House on the Prairie. And I watched a lot of it recently, binge-watched many seasons of it, and it was so slow. I was like, I don't have to watch Laura walk up the hill. I get it. She was at the bottom of the hill, now she's at the top of the hill. Like, just, right? Because it's from the 1970s, and that's what storytelling was in the 1970s. One episode, something like Pa loses his job. The next week, he's like back at his job. No mention of the fact that the episodes were designed to be watched out of sequence. They didn't necessarily add up to much of anything. You fast forward another 40 years, and you get to House of Cards, where not only do they expect that you've seen every single moment that you hit pause to go to the bathroom, and you came back and you saw every minute, but you also saw them in, full, beautiful HD. There was no snow. You didn't have to adjust your rabbit ears, right? The medium changed, and the kind of storytelling that's possible changed. And this is, film and television is now 120 years old. So these mediums are radically still changing. Our medium is not done. Our medium is still going through those kinds of radical changes. And layout on the web is something that we've really struggled with. We haven't had proper tools. Really, for the first time, now that we're 20, 25 years in, we're going to start to do real layout. So when the web started, for those of you maybe who don't remember, this is what every web page, the layout that every web page had. It looked like this. Every web page had a gray background. Every web page, maybe you had an image after a little while. Maybe that image you could censor some things, but that was kind of the limit of what was possible with layout. And then tables. People realized, oh gosh, especially folks who had been doing a lot of desktop publishing and they wanted to get over onto the web, we could use data tables. We could take our pictures and chop them up in pieces and fit them back together like a puzzle. And we could kind of bastardize this thing called HTML to get to jam visual styling into it. There are a lot of reasons that this was a bad idea. The biggest one is that the HTML and the visual styling and the content were like all twisted together, and it made it impossible to redesign. It made it impossible to reuse any sort of code. But in that era, there was a lot of creativity. There was a lot of like crazy different kinds of layouts, because really anything, you kind of do whatever you imagined. I remember when I first started getting on the web and making websites, this was the dominant layout pattern of the web, with websites like this. Or this Microsoft first homepage, right? We loved circles. We thought circles were awesome. Homepages were just places for links. That's all we had. Even when we did columns, somehow columns were much more interesting than they are today. A lot of ideas were coming over from desktop publishing, from using PageMaker. A lot of ideas were coming from like CD-ROMs and interactive fiction and hypertext. And you can see that and evident in the work that's out there today. You look back at the original work. The nav bar, anybody remember when the nav bar was invented? We invented that convention. That didn't exist in the first, 5, 8 years of the web or something. So these things are invented and they come and go, or they come and stay, it depends. Then CSS came along and we realized hey, it's a really good idea to separate your content from your visual styling. It makes for a much more robust system. It means it can be accessible. It means that you can reuse the same content structure with different visual designs. The problem is that CSS didn't really come with a layout model. Absolute positioning, I guess, was supposed to be it. But really all we had was floats. So we sort of taught each other this same layout. We kind of figured out how to do a 2-column, 3-column layout using floats. And then we just had, I don't know, a decade of that. That's sort of all the design. Every design seemed to be like that. And a lot of people, that's when you joined the web, that's when you first got on the web. And it became ingrained in us that this is what websites look like. 960 Grid came along. We realized that maybe a lot of the chaos that we saw could be fixed by kind of coming up with a system, like let's always line things up. 12 is a good number, 960 is a good number, the math works out. Then this happened, right? We realized, oh gosh, every website doesn't fit on a 1024 screen, so maybe we need to, we'll just take that same 12-column idea and we'll make it responsive. We'll just take the sidebars and we'll move them around, right? Things evolve. We were getting to know what might be possible, and this was sort of our first attempt to figure out responsive web design. Then we kind of moved along and we said, you know what, there are some other things we could do. Maybe we should really think about the page in a series of panels and design each panel, which I think is a good idea and one we're going to continue to use. But the designs within each of those panels tend to be very similar, very symmetrical, very rudimentary. We end up with a lot of this Pied Piper website from HBO's Silicon Valley. Right, where everything, you know, how many of you have gone to a website this week where there was a bunch of photos of people in circles with their names underneath them? You could fold this website in half like a piece of paper, and it's symmetrical. And some of that is happening, a lot of that's happening, honestly, because we keep downloading our layouts instead of designing layouts. We download them from some kit that somebody else came out with. Bootstrap is super popular. It's like we're all using the same WordPress theme on all of our websites. I do think that starter kits and frameworks are a really, really good idea. I think we need these tools. You can't start every project with a blank page. You can't try to remember the viewport meta tag from scratch every day. Like, you're going to make some code, you're going to reuse it, whether you reuse the same code on the same project year after year after year, or whether you work at a shop and you have your own kind of starter kit and you use that on every different client project over and over, and it evolves over time, or you want to get ideas from other people's starter kits, so you download their starter kits and you crack them open and you hack ideas and you borrow code from them. And there are lots of ways in which I think we should definitely use starter kits and frameworks and design systems. Design systems have become super popular the last several years. Nicole Sullivan was talking about this a decade ago, encouraging us to object-orient our CSS and to figure out ways to make patterns and to reuse those patterns over and over again. These are good trends. We definitely want to keep doing this. I just think that sometimes the design system world has gotten a little bit overly focused on headlines and buttons and like little bits and pieces, and then, okay, well, we'll take those bits and pieces and we'll add them up together and we'll make a component out of them. And then that's it. That's the end of the discussion. I'm like, okay, cool, you've got your components. How about you design a layout for your components? And instead, what I've seen a lot of is people kind of assume that the layout's going to be a 12-column symmetrical layout, and that the components are just going to drop into the layout. Like, why have a conversation about that? Of course, that's what we're going to do. It's like, well, you don't have to do that. You could do something completely different. Depends on your project. Depends on the story, the brand, and the kind of thing you want to communicate to people. So I really want us, I hope that we will, not only design color palettes and typography palettes for projects, but also design layout projects for palettes. And of course reuse things, of course inspire each other and share code. But to do that the way we inspire and share typography or color. We don't all use the exact same font on every project or the exact same color palette on every project. I think designing custom layout palettes is key to the next major phase of web design, actually. So here is the official timeline of web page layout. I brought this for you here today. We went from the NOAA layout layouts to table-based layouts to hand-coded float-based layouts to framework layouts. And now I think we're really going to leave the framework layout era over the next couple of years, and we're going to go into a new era that is full of unicorn kittens and smiling things. And why do I think this? I think this because of the CSS and the changes to CSS that have happened in the last several years. There's not only CSS Grid, but also Flexbox, the alignment properties that are going to break out of both of those and show up all over the place. Writing modes, multi-column, viewport units, transform, object fit, clip path, masking, initial letter, shape outside. I've talked about a lot of these in past talks in the past couple of years, and I don't have time to talk about any of them today except Grid, because it's the most exciting one. But these are all things that I encourage you to learn about and to figure out how these are going to fit together. We're going to use them all. It's not like we're only going to use Grid and Flexbox is dead to us. Flexbox is awesome. We're going to use these things and combine them. We also have all of the older parts of CSS that are still really important to understand the flow of content, to know what you can do with a negative margin, to know how to use floats. We're going to keep using floats. They're really good for the reason that they were invented in the first place. We're going to want to use them. To understand the difference between block and inline block and all these kinds of things. These are good skills to have. And so many people, I think many folks, have grown up in the era of relying on these frameworks and actually haven't learned how to hand code layout. They don't necessarily know what to do with a negative margin. So I think it's time to go back and learn some of these CSS2 skills, as well as learning all of the newer CSS that's out there. This CSS really does change everything in web design. It really does. So let's talk about CSS Grid. I'm going to focus on this today. I want to really talk about high-level things. There's going to be very little code in this talk. I want everyone, whether you write CSS or you don't, I want you to have a kind of a mental picture, a mental idea of what's possible out there. I want to talk some about the nature of CSS Grid, what it wants to do for us, the kind of biases that it brings, and the things that it wants to make the web do. And I want to bust some assumptions about it, kind of get us away from the frameworks and the habits that we have from the frameworks. So first, there's this idea of explicit and implicit in understanding or working with Grid, where you can explicitly do something or you can implicitly do it. It's a big concept in Grid. So for example, you could define the number of columns, or you can define the size of a column, or the number of rows, the size of the rows, and say, this is explicitly what I want you to do. Or you can kind of not. You can be lazy. You can be like, I don't know. You figure out how many rows. I don't know how big that's going to be. You figure out how big that's going to be. And the browser will do that work for us. We can let it implicitly decide how many rows to make or how many columns to make or how big to make those things. We can explicitly place items and say, I want this box to be in this cell. Or we cannot do that. And the Grid auto-placement algorithm will just start laying content out for us. And if that's where we want our content to be, then, hey, we're done. We can go home early. We don't have to do any more code. We also have rows and columns, which when I first heard this, I thought, well, you know, columns, Grid columns are for lining things up. I guess Grid rows are also for lining things up. That'll be nice. And the deeper I've gotten into understanding the Grid, the more I realize that it's not necessarily about lining things up. It's about being able to define space in a vertical direction and to define rows. And that is maybe the most profound thing about Grid out of all of it, is that we have rows for the first time, or the first time since we started using CSS. So this is what the layout that we've, the Grid system that we've tend to be, that most of us have been using the last 5 years, rows. Charts also don't have to be the same size as each other. They can be different sizes. And then you can have rows of different sizes. And already it's looking much more interesting than it was a moment ago. You can also have it set up so that content is sized by the size of the track. You define a column, the column has a track, the content becomes the size of the column that it's in. That's sort of the way that we've been doing it the last 5-10 years. But we can flip that, and we can instead say, I would like this track, I would like this row or this column, I don't know how big it's going to be. I want it to be whatever size it needs to be in order to hold the content that's inside of it, which is something that we really haven't been doing with CSS before. And we can combine these things together. So we could say, define that first column as a fixed pixel size, and define the last column as being set by the size of the content. And then the columns in between are going to be whatever's left over. We're going to look at the amount of space that's left over and make one of it 2 portions of the space and another 1 portion of the space. So the portional sized columns are squishy, and the other ones are kind of fixed, and all of this gets mixed together in a way that we have not seen before. This is not how it's worked before. Also, content doesn't have to fill a track. So far, we've been under this kind of consensual hallucination where we think we've had columns, but we didn't really have columns. We just put content in places and we made it a certain size, and then we stood back and went, look at that column. It looks like there's a column there because that content is this certain size. But now we actually have a column. We actually have a track. And the content could be any size. It could be bigger and stick out. It could be smaller and hang out inside of the area that it's within. And that then opens up these alignment properties that you might be familiar with from Flexbox, where you can say, OK, I want you to be up against the start edge or against the end edge, which means the left edge or the right edge. I would like you to be centered with the justify items property or the align items property. I would like you to be, we're so used to everything being crammed up against the top of stuff. It's just sort of, that's what everything is. Doesn't everything have to be at the top of everything? That's how, no, it doesn't. We can actually have things line up along the bottom edge. You can have a bunch of different things that are different heights and line them all up along the bottom edge. Or you can have vertical centering in grid. These are the kinds of things that we've gotten really excited about Flexbox with, but we can actually now do these in grid and do them in 2 dimensions, not just 1. So you might have a layout that looks something like this, or like this, where this pink box, I've said, I want you to be in these 2 columns and these 3 rows, and then I want you to center yourself in the space in that area. So it doesn't actually line up. We're just using grid to place things. You can use CSS Grid to line things up and to make things lots of very nice and even in where you want them to be, but you don't have to. You can just kind of like use CSS Grid to put stuff in random places if you'd like to. So I've just rattled off a whole lot of possibilities. More possibilities means more work. Like, what in the world? How am I going to know what to do with all of these things? What do we do with CSS Grid? How do we know where to put things? And this is where I think the answer to that question is design. We're going to design our way into the places, into figuring out what it is that we want to do. And I think that graphic design principles from 20th century modern graphic design can really come in here and help us quite a bit. I highly recommend this book, if you've never seen it before, by Ellen Lipton and Jennifer Cole Phillips. It's both a really great book if you've never studied graphic design formally, ever, never taken an art class. There's a lot of really juicy stuff there. But if you have, and you don't really want to read a beginner's book that's sort of insulting to you or something, this is a really good book because it's really masterful and it kind of doesn't belittle folks. So I like this book a lot. I learned a lot from it. And there are these principles in here. I'll just name a few. These are the kinds of principles that I think if we begin to understand them and we think about these things as we're looking at our designs, we can start to figure out what it is that we want to do. So one of them is visual hierarchy. It's this idea that things can visually be louder, bigger, bolder, stronger, or they can be quieter, smaller, sort of in the background. And it's not about whether or not things are in the upper left-hand corner, but it's about how visually strong they are. You can have things that are second, but they stand out to be first. I think in the web we've gotten into this really weird habit where we just sort of assume that all the most important stuff should go in the upper left-hand corner. And if the further away from the upper left-hand corner it is, the less important it is. That's not how it is in any other graphic design. So maybe that's not necessarily what we want to do. Maybe we really want to use the principles of visual hierarchy instead. Symmetry is another one. I feel like on the web we've just sort of, everything is symmetrical and we just sort of don't even notice anymore. But you know what else is awesome? Asymmetry. Asymmetry is awesome. And because you see it so rarely on the web right now, it really stands out as something special. It really gets people's attention. This is almost a drawing of a web page, right? Where instead you could bring asymmetry into your designs. Proximity is an interesting principle. It has to do with the way that our brains work. If you take a bunch of things and you put them close to each other and there's space and they're further away from each other, the groups are away from each other, but they're things inside little groups that are close to each other. Just at first glance, people's brains will just automatically associate the things that are close as a thing. They must belong together. That must be why they're close together. And if they're not close together, that must mean they don't belong together. And we could really use these principles. As I talk about layout, a lot of folks will come to me and say, I don't want to change the layouts because I don't want to break user experience. Our users need to know where everything is. If we move things around, it's going to be hard for them. And I understand that. We definitely want to make sure that we don't do some crazy user experience where nobody knows where anything is and everybody's lost. That would be a horrible idea. But we can use these ideas from graphic design. We can use a principle like proximity to say, you know what, I think we can actually alter the layout of the nav bar, but we'll use the proximity principle to make sure that it's still really obvious what's going on. These are the things that are going to make it possible to do changes without breaking everything. Density is another principle. We're used to things just being so dense. Everything on the web, everything's just crammed together. And that's because of the nature of floats. I actually think of floats now as having a bathtub full of water with like 1,000 bars of soap in it. And all the soap is just like floating. Everything needs to be against the top of the water. Everything has to be up against the top of the web page. That's how floats work. There was no way to kind of push something further down the page. Now with CSS Grid, there is. So we don't have to make everything to be super dense. We can actually open things up and add white space to our designs. Platon has this quote that I really like. He's a famous photographer who said this in an episode of Abstract on Netflix. My deep respect for form in positive and negative space comes from studying Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of compression and expansion. You walk into a Wright building, and the entranceway is so small it makes you almost dip your head. And then as soon as you walk into the main room, he blows up the space, and it makes you feel, oh, that's so good. This is a photographer studying architecture in order to better understand the possibilities inside photography. He's also talking about experiencing compression and expansion over time, and that you experience one and then you experience the other, and that transition from one to the other creates this feeling. And that's something that we have on the web, is we have an element of time, which I'll talk more about later. So there are graphic design principles out there, and I think it's time for us to kind of up our game and go up another level, right? Bring things up another level by bringing more of these graphic design principles to the web yet again. I also think that there's a bunch of graphic design principles that are of the web that only exist on the web because of the nature of our medium, that it is unique and it's unlike any other artistic medium. And we can really start to, I hope we start to better explore and articulate to each other what some of these principles are and how we might more consciously make decisions as we do our designs. So I have a bunch of examples I'm going to show you. They're right now up at labs.jensimmons.com. You can check them out and dig into the code, or check them out later, show them to other people. I'm going to go through what I've discovered so far running experiments over the last couple of years, just sitting around opening up cool graphic design books and being like, can I build that on the web? What happens? Oh my gosh, this happens. I'm going to show you what I've discovered. 6 things. So number 1, overlap. So overlap is something that we see all the time in magazine design, for example, books. You go look at a bunch of book covers in a bookstore, you're going to see overlap. You're not confused when there's words over top of somebody's face. You aren't like, wow, did they really have those words on their face? Like, no, you understand that those are 2 separate things being overlapped, one over the other. Our audiences understand the principle of overlap. We're just not using it on the web because the only thing we really kind of had to do overlap was absolute positioning, and absolute positioning is evil, so we just avoided it. But now with CSS Grid, we could do overlap, and it works really well. It's super robust. It doesn't break. It's totally responsive, and it's actually not that hard to do. So, oh my gosh, for design, as designers, to think about using overlap, and how might we want to use overlap in our designs. So I'm going to dig into this example really quick, but I want to show you in Firefox. I work at Mozilla. We built the Firefox browser, and I've been collaborating with the DevTools team and some other folks in and outside of Mozilla over the last 1.5 years to build this Firefox CSS Grid Inspector in our DevTools. So I want to show you how it works. If you find in your HTML the place where you've written display grid, or if someone else has written display grid, you find where it says display grid, there's like a little icon, and you can click it, and it will turn on the grid lines for you. Or even better, there's this new layout tab, and you can click the layout tab. There's going to be a whole bunch of tools in here. There's one for now, and you can click, and you can see a list of all the grids that are on that page, and you can turn it on. You can change the color of the lines to find a better color for your site. You can hover over. You can hover over and see things. You can turn on the numbers, which is super duper helpful. You can extend the lines, so you can sort of see if this grid lines up with this other grid and get the different grids on your page to line up with each other. The plan eventually is to make it so you can turn on more than one grid at a time. It worked for a minute, but the performance was horrible, so we had to turn it back off. But we'll fix that. And then over here, this example from Rachel's Grid by Example.com, Rachel Andrew, if you were using area names, you can click and you can see the area names. We're also working on a tool to display the line names, which we don't have yet, but eventually we will. And we just finished a tool not only to see the positive line numbers, but now you can see the negative line numbers. We're about to land this in Firefox Nightly. It's not there yet, but it will be very soon. And by the way, if you want to see kind of the cutting edge set of tools as they come out, download Firefox Nightly and check it out, because all the new stuff is in Nightly. And then it takes, I don't know, several months for it to land in the release version of Firefox. But the CSS Grid Inspector, whether you write code or not, can be really cool. You can just surf around and check out other people's grid examples and kind of get ideas, see how it was that they defined things. So overlap, I'm not going to show you the codes for this because it's so simple, it's kind of not even worth taking the time to do it. But you can go check this out. This is a kind of a riff on a very famous poster style from the Swiss modernists that I saw in a book, and I wanted to know if I could do it as a web page, so I did. And that's sort of, there's the grid, the way that I kind of laid the whole thing out. The circles are translucent, they overlap over each other, and that's how you end up with those intersections of the circles. Or here, you know, we're so used to teasers where you have this image, and then you put the headline underneath it, and maybe the teaser copy the lead. You could overlap the headline over the image, right? Very subtle. Users are not going to be confused by this, but it brings a different sense of brand or a different sense of story. It conveys something to your audience by doing something different, like using overlap. So overlap, try it out. It's awesome. The viewport. So I think a lot about this viewport. We work inside a viewport. Let's first, though, think about a medium that doesn't have a viewport. These posters, right? There's no viewport on these posters. These, especially these posters, are designed to be wheat pasted to the wall and to grab your attention as you're walking down the street, and they're competing with each other for our attention. Here's an example, for instance, where I think density doesn't actually help. I think expansion and some space actually gets more attention than something that's dense. Visual hierarchy comes into play here. It doesn't matter what's in the upper left-hand corner and bottom right-hand corner. Nobody cares. What matters is what's big and loud. And then as you get closer, you're getting, the people who design this want their audience to walk physically and get closer and closer. And then you're able to get closer in and see all the detail. That's how this poster works. Here's a poster that I found in a book, a jazz poster. And here, you know, you see this photograph of Winston Marsalis playing the trumpet. And you see his body kind of all at once. You see these pink boxes. The word jazz is pretty small. The one in the title is especially small. The one in the logo is bigger. But the boxes, the pink boxes and the trumpet conveys jazz. The boxes almost are like musical notes, although they are a little bit square and a little bit robotic. But it's the layout that conveys the story here. You put this inside a web page. First of all, I was like so excited that I could actually do this with CSS Grid. Look, the very first thing, the thing closest to the top left corner, isn't even the headline. The title of the page is second, and you can still totally see it. But I don't see all of Winston Marsalis's body. I just see his eyes and his face, and I don't see all the boxes at once. We see them unveiled through this viewport, through time. And in some ways, it's more like jazz than the poster. Those boxes appearing feel more like musical notes. The trumpet appearing is kind of more dramatic. The logo being at the bottom doesn't work, right? That doesn't work at all. So there's a way in which having a viewport really radically changes how the design functions. I think we all understand the viewport as users. You probably have a physical sense in your body of exactly how far you need to scroll to get to the customer reviews on Amazon pages, right? You probably know just how many times you have to move your hand to do that. But as designers, as stakeholders, as developers, we seem to sit in these meetings where we look at things like this. And we have debates about whether or not this design is working. We email each other these PDFs, and then, or we print them out and tape it to the wall and stand back and look at the, who knows, who in the world has a mental model of the Amazon.com product page that looks like this, right? So there's this disconnect between the way in which we're talking to each other about design and the way that people actually experience our designs. And honestly, frequently in these meetings where we email each other PDFs, somehow magically all the PDFs are 8.5 by 11 aspect ratio designs, as if every web page is always an 8.5 by 11 aspect ratio height thing, right? Like we're off. We're off. This is what we really need to be thinking about instead, is we've got this long, skinny vertical space, and we've got this viewport. And the viewport sometimes is wide in sort of landscape mode. Sometimes it's smaller in a portrait mode. We don't know. We don't know what, we can't control that aspect ratio of the viewport. But we know we have a viewport, and we know we usually, not always, but usually we have some sort of vertical scrolling going on. So I've been wondering, how is it that we could better think about this viewport and better design to the viewport without having to get to code sooner? Because sometimes you just really need to sketch on a napkin. Sometimes you really do just need to have a conversation that's super low fidelity. And I've thought a lot about the fact that we're not the only industry that has this problem. This is also something that comes up in filmmaking. And they solve this problem with storyboards. So if you're going to go and sit down and plan out a $50 million film and you want to get to set and know where you're going to put the camera and how many shots you need ahead of time, you're going to sit down and plan all this out with your cinematographer, with your director, with whoever else, your art director. And storyboards are key to how film has always figured this out. And it's not because they're drawing every single solitary frame of the movie. They can't take the storyboards and make an animated film out of it. They're just taking moments. They're just drawing some of the frames. And they're just standing back and going, is this enough? Is this really what we want to do? And I think we could do that some with web design, where instead of drawing the whole page, you draw a part of the page. You see what it's like maybe when somebody scrolls halfway down. Is there some sort of a moment we want to create? Maybe we set up a data visualization halfway through an article, and we want to see how it is that we're going to display that data visualization inside the viewport. And we have something else going on with photographs or an app, and you want to like, how is the interface, the buttons for this application going to work at different viewports? And maybe you want to design that. You could design that with a storyboard rather than trying to draw the whole thing. Or this, I really like this. Somebody wanted to print it out, but rather than printing it out and putting it on the wall, they like sit there, right? It's sort of a low fidelity way to think about what the viewport is doing and how it affects our users' experience of something. I also think that we've been thinking so much in the fixed size era, we were always thinking about the top edge, and we're thinking about the left edge all the time. And then we sort of realized, oh my gosh, there is a right-hand edge. We should design for the right-hand edge, and we should make our designs change depending on how wide or how narrow the viewport is. But we still pretend like there is no fourth edge. We sit in meetings and say, there is no fold, there's no fold, stop talking about. Okay, it's true, we don't actually fold the screens, but there is a bottom edge. There is a fourth edge. And I think we finally have the tools to design to all four edges. And I think it could be kind of awesome. So here's an example. Michael Pollan has a website up. This is sort of a simplified version of his current site that is fixed width, right? So maybe if we were brought in to change it, we would say, OK, we get it, responsive. Let's make it responsive. We'll make it like this. This is how responsive sites go. They get narrower and narrower. But the fourth edge, who knows? We can't really control anything about that. Well, now we can. So in this design, everything moves around, both vertically and horizontally. The things change in the sizing, and the proportions of the space are being moved so that it kind of always looks beautiful, paying attention to all four edges. This is the kind of work we can do now with CSS Grid and some of the other CSS that has showed up. And this code runs now. I mean, this exists now. We don't have to wait for this to come out. So how are we doing this? This is using a combination of grid rows and columns, the alignment properties, and viewport units. Here's another example. It relies heavily on viewport units, where those boxes, the red background and the dark gray background, each of those are the exact height of the viewport. You have been seeing this a lot on the New York Times Magazine website or on the Atlantic website when they have a big magazine cover article. They'll do like a cover that's the height of the viewport. And when you scroll, all these different things are shaped differently or sized differently based on the space that's available. I'm doing that with viewport units, viewport height units and viewport width units. You can start to measure things in viewport units. Or here, I'm using vmin to make that circle be 50% of the minimum, whichever is a smaller length. This viewport, what is it that we do with it? It also reminds me, I picked up a Bolex camera for the first time 15 years ago and shot a short black and white film. And I felt like I was looking through a toilet paper tube. It freaked me out so much. I had no idea. I was like, how in the world am I supposed to make a film when I can only show like this little tiny amount of space in the world? That question is a question that filmmaking has grappled with the whole time for 130 years. It's an entire art of studying framing. When do you want to use a close-up? When do you use a long shot? When do you cut from one to the other? How is it that you want to frame a shot? It's something that people understand as an artistic medium, and they understand the kind of effects on storytelling that these choices make. And because filmmaking has been around for such a long time, they had like another 100 years more than we've had to figure out what to do. And now the idea of where do you put the camera, when do you move it, why, when do you pan, which lens do you use is so complicated. There's this incredibly intense master course that came out on DVD many years ago now, but I want to show you a little clip with it because I think it's a great way to understand why these things matter beyond the technical reasons.
The close push is one of the most useful and expressive moves we can do, and there are good reasons to use it in most scenes. It's tempting to do slow pushes as often as possible because of the production value, but it's when we stick to motivated pushes that we bring out the story. Most people choose when to push intuitively, but we'll try to put words to that by suggesting that close pushes are for meaningful moments. Most of what goes on in a scene is, of course, not a meaningful moment. Here the red man is talking about something that has no meaning at all, maybe the pizza he had for lunch. But let's do a close push anyway. As he talks about the double cheese crust and the extra layer of pepperoni, the push assigns meaning to the situation, even if there isn't any.
There's a kind of filmic language out there. There's reasons to do these things or to not do these things, right? And I wonder if we might come up with a Webic language or continue to come up with. I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years. We've been talking about these things for 20 years. But I wonder if there's a way in which we can talk about it even more and come up with what is it that this language is that we're messing around with? What does it mean to have a reading experience with a frame where things move in and out of a frame? What does it mean to have an interaction experience with this frame where things come and go, whether you scroll vertically or horizontally? The viewport, I think it's a big part of what layout, when you're thinking about layouts, I think thinking about the viewport is part of what we really need to think about. White space, I've alluded to it, but I think this is also really important, white space. We can actually now leave space in our layouts. We don't have to have everything crammed up against the top of the screen. You can see the grid lines on. I've explicitly placed these items. If you explicitly place items, you can place them in such a fashion that you've left a lot of white space. You can make a Monopoly board, and you can make things go all the way around in a circle. You can make things go up instead of down. Leila and Massimo Vanelli are very famous graphic designers from the mid and late 20th century, and they put out this little book called the Vanelli Canon, and I like this quote from the book. Great designs can be achieved without the use of the grid, but the grid is a very useful tool to guarantee results. Ultimately, the most important tool is the management of the white space in layouts. It is the white space that makes the layout sing. Bad layouts have no space left for breathing. Every little space is covered by a cacophony of type sizes, images, and screaming titles. Does that sound familiar? I can barely breathe. There's all kinds of great ideas from the mid-20th century, early 20th century, both from Europe and from the United States, from the modernists, whether it's like the Swiss modernists, Bauhaus, the constructivists. There's all these different artistic movements that had all these different really great ideas out there. And I've gone and taken a lot of those ideas and lifted them and seen what does it mean to do those on the web? How is it I could do that in a kind of fluid or flexible way? What about those designs is important that we might want to borrow from, and what is it that is just completely irrelevant to us because we're not designing for paper? And you can check these out and check out the code. These all depend on using CSS Grid, and it's possible because of CSS Grid. So I took the Mondrian, famous Mondrian painting and made a responsive Mondrian out of it. Right? What if this were a teaser landing page, and these were all like, bits of content that you wanted people to click on? There's a whole bunch of ideas from these modernists about what a grid is. In fact, if you think about graphic design and grids, you're going to probably immediately start to, whether you know it or not, think about and having voices in your head telling you how you're supposed to do things. These modernists were very pushy people. They were very, I don't know, some of them were like, fascists, and they had all kinds of ideas. about the proper font to use, the proper way to use the grid, and the proper way to run a nation. Like, okay, this is a little scary. Like, I don't know that I want most of that back. So I think we should be careful in this era about getting too dogmatic about our grid systems. And I think a lot of what they were saying maybe is useful for the web, and maybe it's not useful for the web. They had ideas around taking grids, and they're looking at the edges of a piece of paper and like figuring out sort of the perfect aspect ratio of a cell. Although it's not called a cell, it's called a module. And like, ooh, this module is the best module of all the modules. And this is, right, line up things in this way. This is how you line things up. Massimo Vanelli has very, very famously did this very specific way of doing things. His work has a very strong look because of it. It's pretty cool, but also, you know, maybe, I don't know, it depends. It always depends. So should we take these grids and sort of shove them in the viewport? I don't know. Can we control the size of the page, the size of the piece of paper? No. Can we line things up using CSS Grid or using these? Yes. You can line up things to your heart's content with CSS Grid. Make sure all the things line up. So that's cool. Can we create white space? Yes, absolutely. That's something that they loved. Let's do that. Can we maintain our aspect ratios? Can we define a grid so that the cells of the grid have a certain aspect ratio always? No. We don't have a tool for that. I'm lobbying inside the CSS working group to try to get a tool for that because I think it could be cool and useful. But right now, you don't really have any control over that. So your aspect ratio, unless you define your grid using viewport units, there's no other way to kind of get your grid to have a certain aspect ratio. So there's certain things about what the modernists want that we can do, and there's certain things we couldn't even do if we wanted to. But I did think, well, let me take a page from the Vanelli canon and take the layout from that page, and let me see what happens if I put it on the web. There's the URL for this example if you want to dig into it yourself. There's the kind of grid lines on it, the way that I wanted it to look. So let's check it out. It is really kind of interesting to have the text line up with the top of these photos and to have this extra space between paragraphs of text in a way that isn't very common on the web. But then we start to take the edge of the, the line of the length is getting kind of long, and then, oh, right, it is the crash web. Right, this is the web, right? It's a flexible, fluid medium, and this sort of way of being very controlling doesn't quite translate. So, are we going to grid like a modernist? I don't know. I'm not really in the mood to be dogmatic in the era of our current political situation. So I kind of feel like maybe sometimes when the mood strikes, we'll follow the principles that they laid out. But maybe we really need to have our own principles because the web is different. But meanwhile, white space. I think white space really is the lesson from those modernists and from those principles of Europe and the United States and these ideas about grid, that white space is something that we can really take advantage of. Verticality. So, you know, kind of this idea that these, well, I'll just say it, white dudes from the 20th century who loved Helvetica. There's a way in which even now people fetishize them. There's this sort of resurgence of a love of this kind of world. But I associate that kind of world in some ways to maps like this map, like this idea, this colonial idea of the superiority of a certain race on the planet in the middle of the 20th century. Like, it's not really accurate at all, that map. And there are whole other cultures and whole other parts of the globe have deep and rich graphic design traditions and a lot to offer us when it comes to understanding layout and understanding what we might want to do. Sadly, there aren't nearly as many books. I could go buy 1,000 books off of Amazon.com in the next 45 minutes that kind of support this European modernist tradition. I could only find 2 that have to do with Arabic graphic design in English, the language that I know. So I think it's harder for us. I think we have to work harder to try to tap into other parts of the planet and other cultures. But I really think that there's a lot to gain from doing that. And especially when I think about verticality, and I'm thinking about this vertical space with this viewport. Asian graphic design, especially Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, there's this deep tradition of vertical graphic design that we can really look to. I was just in Japan doing research and looking at just the number of books in the stores that are focused on layout and focused on Japanese layout graphic design is incredible, far more than you see in English traditions. And the way in which books meticulously lay out vertical text, which was heavily influenced by the 20th century modernists. I mean, there's all this collision between modern Japan and modern Europe when it came to graphic design and what it meant for vertical layouts in Japan, which is really rich and very interesting. In fact, they're much more particular than we are. But there's some just amazing things out there that we can look at and think about. What does it mean to design vertically? What does it mean to design in a vertical space? What does it mean to design horizontal text in a vertical space? What does it mean to take something in English and turn it sideways and have it be part of a vertical layout? And we can look as well, I think, to the way that Japan approaches the grid. They do have very strict rules about how to use a grid, how to create a character grid, how to line every single solitary thing up, every edge of every photo and every border on every box to that kind of character grid. So there's a lot there. These photos really, I find beautiful because they're boxes in vertical spaces. And that, to me, is what the web is. The web is a bunch of boxes in vertical spaces. So I took these photos especially, and I kind of made a very, very stripped down experiment just to see, using CSS Grid, what does it mean to have boxes in a vertical space? What could I learn about having a vertical space? I wish I had more to say about it. I don't, other than, hey, we should go explore this world, because I think there's something here about really understanding our verticality of the web. The fifth principle, the fifth idea is flexibility. Everything has changed when it comes to flexibility. Here's a Swiss modernist poster that I saw in a book, and I said, hey, let me make an example out of it. But again, because the web is flexible and fluid, how is it that I want to take something that's static and translate it over into something that's moving? The red text lines up with the edge of the letter F, so I want to maintain that all of the time. I'm going to keep that going. But though the way that the words overlap or the size of the letters could change maybe. We've been designing all of our layouts and setting all of our layouts using these kinds of units, using pixels, using ems or rems, and using percents. And we could have all kinds of nerd wars about whether it's better to use pixels or ems or rems, but basically they're all the same. They basically all get calculated to pixels. And in fact, percents do too. You know, you sort of say, well, I want to break this into 50%, 50%, but the moment the viewport size is known, the browser calculates that back out to a fixed pixel size. So they're actually in some ways not that different from each other. And when we've been setting our layouts in percents, basically what we're doing is, you got 25, 25, 25, 25%. Those four things change and grow equally at the same time as each other. That's the limit of the flexibility that we've had so far. But now we have new things, new ways to define track sizes, new ways to define content sizes. I'm going to talk about these four: min content, max content, FR units, and min max. And these really redefine what flexibility is, and it opens up the world of possibilities pretty broadly. So here's an example. Jan Tschichold, famous, the new typography from the 20s. This is an event advertisement. And I saw this and thought, oh gosh, can I lay this out in Grid? This is like what I've been doing for the last 2 years. I just wander around and look at things and go, can I lay that out in Grid? This is how I learned Grid. I would just answer that question by trying. And here you can see the way that things line up. Like, that's what I want to maintain, is the integrity of certain text lining up with certain text. So I took a horrible photo of it, and I drew some horrible lines on it just to figure out how many lines I need, and then I figured out how to explicitly place each of these bits of content to where they need to go. But then the question became, well, how do I size my tracks in order to get the kind of layout that I want that's flexible? There's the URL for the end result. So that second column that says free entry, I sized that, telling the computer to make that track be max content width. So what in the world does that mean? So max content, normally, or in the past, 2014, you would size a box with a size, whether you said 200 pixels or whether you said 50%. It had a pixel size box. And then you poured content in, you poured words into that box, and the words would lay out and wrap. The box has size, and the wrapping would take its whatever it was doing from the size of the box. But instead, we can make that box be max content width. And by making the box be max content width, we're basically saying, look, just take the content and stretch it out to the maximum length you can possibly stretch it out. Don't make it any longer. We don't want extra yellow box. But just make it the width it needs to be for this amount of this phrase of words. Or min content is going the other direction, where you just make it as small as possible. You don't want the words to stick out of the box, so basically it's going to be the width of the longest word. In this case, the word several is the longest word, so the box becomes that width of the word several. So I take that idea and I make that second column be max content. And the computer's going to look at it, and it's going to see the phrase free entry, and it's going to make it the width of that phrase free entry. And then if I make the first column also max content, then those two columns together are max content. And so the computer looks and says, OK, well, now I'm going to look at the phrase Jan Chichold. I'm going to make that be, and I cheated by making the colon be after a pseudo element because I wanted it to not be calculated in the size. And it takes the name, and it says, OK, I'm going to make those two tracks together be the width of this name. And that's how those are being sized. The last column is getting it's a min content width, and it looks at the contents, and right. And then this middle track is a 1FR. So the middle track is flexible. Those other tracks are actually fixed size, but their fixed size is based on the size of the content. So this is the end result, where you can see that it's only that third column that's squishing or growing, right? But it's maintaining the qualities that made this design be what it is. And then if we change the length of the text, we make it Jan Chichold, then it moves the line so that it fits, right? Which is perfect for a content system, for a design system, where you've got a component and you're going to be using it for all kinds of content. And you really don't know how long or short the content is. You really don't know what's going on. We can program our system so that it handles things in the ways that we want it to. So then what is this FR unit? You've probably heard that a lot already today, but what the heck is this? So let me explain. By going back to the kinds of things that we would do in 2014 all the time. Let's make 3 boxes that are the same as each other and put them side by side. So great, we're going to have a container, we're going to have that be 100%, we're going to split up the 100%, 33, 33, 33%, right? Except actually it's 33.3333%, but has anybody written a blog post recently telling us how many decimal points we need in our percents? Because I can't remember if it's like 4 or 6, or if we decided we needed more or less, or what a waste of time. Actually, 33.3333% is going to be, there's no space between them, there's no gutter, so I need to, let me try a 2% gutter. So, OK, get out some Algebra 1, right? They told us we didn't need to know algebra. We do. So, OK, 32%. So each of the columns is 32%. That's going to work out that math. But you know, the 2% gutter, it really isn't very big, especially on small screens. So let me try a 3% gutter. So it's 31.333%. But 3% is really annoying on big screens. It's far too big. It's far too wide. So let me do it again, 2.5%. So now I've got the number of the devil in my code. And already I've spent way longer on this than I want to. And I don't really want to set my gutter in percent. I really want to set my gutter in ems, because I really would like that space to stay consistent no matter how big the viewport is. And I would really like it to be tied to my typography, not tied to the size of the screen. So what's x? How can I solve this for x? Well, I can't solve this for x as the front-end developer. This needs to be calculated after the viewport width size is known. So I got to use calc. So here I go. I got to put my algebra in the calc equation. But this is only going to work at this particular breakpoint, because I'm going to have more columns at other breakpoints. All I'm doing is the most basic layout ever. And look at how hard this is. So what has the solution to this been? Bootstrap that baby. like I don't want to write this code for the 17th time in 2 years. I'm just going to download a framework. I can use Foundation or Singularity or SUSE or Grid Setup, or there's a bazillion options, right? That's why we've been using frameworks. But you know what? We don't need those frameworks anymore, because now we have FR units. And instead, what we'll do is this. And we'll say, I want my gutters, my gaps to be 2M, and I want the columns to each be 1 FR, and you do the math. Turns out computers are really good at doing math. So what does this mean? It means the computer is going to say, 1FR, 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 1, 1, 1, that makes 3. That means you get 1/3, you get 1/3, you get 1/3. Or as soon as now, I don't have to change the size on the columns. The size on the columns can stay at 1FR, but as soon as there's 4 columns instead, the computer goes, oh, you said 1FR 4 times. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 4, so you get 1/4, you get 1/4, you get 1/4. That's how FR units work. It makes it super easy for us, and it makes all sorts of possibilities open up, like this, where we can say the first column is a fixed size, and these other columns are flexible. This is why it's possible to do these kinds of layouts when we couldn't do them with percents. Or this kind of layout where we're saying, I want the first column to be fixed pixels, I want the last column to be min content, I want these other ones to be ratios of each other and be flexible. Or here, I want all of these to be flexible ratio-based columns, but I want them to be some sort of a ratio-based array. I don't want it to be a symmetrical layout. I want it to be based on the golden ratio or some other kind of ratio, which is something that Mark Bolton has been trying to get us to do for a very long time, to not make everything be 12 symmetrical columns, but to use odd numbers of columns and to use things that are based off of other maths. Here's an example from an article at Illustrapart where on the left, everything is in symmetrical columns, or 6 columns that are the same size as each other, and on the right, it's 6 columns, basically the exact same layout, but the columns are not the same as each other. And it gives a very different feeling. The one on the left is almost boring in a way, and the one on the right feels more trustworthy or fresher, simply because the ratio of the columns was changed. Min-max is another property that I want to tell you about. So here, right, this is a way, you may, if you've seen anything about grid code, you may have actually seen this already, where you can have a responsive set of boxes that get squishy and bigger or smaller, and the number of columns changes. This is done with 1 line of code, or 2 lines of code. Display grid, grid template columns, repeat, autofit, min-max 100 to 1FR. And the min-max statement is basically saying, I want you to make these columns, and I want each of those columns to be a minimum of 100 pixels and a maximum of 1FR. I want you to repeat that pattern. I want the computer to figure out how many columns to make. You don't need any media queries whatsoever, and you get the layout that you just saw. It's so much easier than what we were doing before. Here's another example, though, where I'm using min-max in a different way, a simpler way, that I find pretty fascinating. So the first column is 100 pixels fixed. The second, third, and last column are each 1FR, and then the content column, the column with the article in it, is min-max 40 characters to 65 characters. I get to say what I actually mean. I would like this to be something between 40 characters and 65 characters. You do the math. I gotta go, right? And then this is the result. And I find this fascinating. So the 1FR columns are collapsing first, and they collapse down to min content size, which in this case, because those columns are empty, is 0. And then the article column starts collapsing. Did you see that? They don't all collapse at the same time. The FRs collapse first, the min-max collapses second. There's actually a third tier of flexibility as well if you define things using auto, which I won't get into right now. But there's ways in which you can actually have the flexibility happen in stages, or you can have the squishiness, this factor of what gets smaller or what gets bigger, happen in stages rather than happen all at once. It really means that this idea of pixel perfect is completely out the window. If you're sitting there and having conversations with somebody and they're like, that needs to be 15 pixels to the left, what does that mean? That's not how the web works. It also means that this is just really not your father Ethan's responsive web design anymore. This idea of using percents or calculating everything out to some sort of pixel idea and then doing division and turning things into percents and that kind of technique is just not how we're going to be doing things anymore. In fact, I think we're going to really walk away from percents quite a lot. You can use percents if you want to, but I'm not really sure that we're going to want to. I think we're going to really be using FR units because they're far better. What we're doing really now is programming a flexibility model, coming up with a model of flexibility and programming it in the CSS. That's the job as a designer when you're coming up with a layout now. The question at hand is what happens when part of the content or the interface is missing? Or what happens when they're longer than you expected or shorter than you expected? These are the important questions, not is that on the pixel, 15 pixels to the left, like I told you to make it. Flexibility, this is really the future of web design and understanding where it is that we're going and what's happening. And finally, creativity. this is really a time where we can get quite creative. We can look back at the 90s. I also look a lot at the 90s as well as the 20th century graphic design to just get ideas from the time when the web was new and we kind of thought anything was possible and we were doing crazy things. I saw this, I follow robots who like tweet out pictures of 1990s websites, and this came up one day, and I saw that now you can land new customers, and I was like, how evil do I have to be to lay that out in modern code? Like, could I do it? Would it be evil? Would it be kind of awesome? I don't know. Let me try. So I put that into example, and I started doing that with CSS Grid. I put some spans around each of those phrases so I could lay them out and change the font sizes. I still don't know whether or not I think that's evil, but it's not a photograph of a piece of text that I laid out in Photoshop, so it's not as evil as the original was. And then, as I was staring at this thing, I noticed the navigation, and I was like, oh my gosh, that navigation, I love it. It's so obvious that it's navigation because it's so similar to what we're used to, but it's not what we're used to. The words are staggered up and above and below this line, like, what could I? So I laid that part out with Grid, and that's a separate grid. That's how Grid works. You like lay this little part out with Grid, you lay this other little part out with Grid, and then I kind of got in deep. I was like, well, if I'm already here, I might as well lay out the whole header. So the whole header is laid out with another grid. So the navigation grid is nested inside the header grid, and then I went ahead and redid the whole balloon and the whole thing, and so it's overlapping. That text is real text overlapped with a drop shadow over top of a photo that I went and made similar to the original photo, so that it could be real content. It could be semantically marked up. It could be all the things that we weren't doing when we were originally coding these up in the 90s. And also it could be creative, just to stretch muscles, just to see what's possible. So here are the 6 things that I've talked about today: overlap, viewport, white space, verticality, flexibility, and creativity. I think if we pursue these 6 things, we will end up someplace really magical. It's time to play. It's time to learn. It's time to put time into learning. CSS is not going to go away, though, during your career. So if you put a lot of time into learning CSS, that is time well spent. It will not disappear the way that Bootstrap is about to disappear. And here, so this Firefox Grid Inspector, probably a key to what you need. Here's the URL if you want to go download Firefox nightly. I'm working on a project, I keep saying this, but I really am working on a project that's going to be up at layout.land, a lot of videos and a lot of demos and a lot of opportunity to share with each other ideas about layout. Drop your email in there, and I will email you when it eventually launches. Labs.jensimmons.com is where all my demos are. Also, if you go to jensimmons.com, this talk is the 3rd of a trilogy, and the other 2 parts are online right now. You can go watch them if you want to learn about other things like CSS shapes or more about viewport units and all kinds of object fit, all kinds of stuff. Check it out. If you want to learn more about Grid, there's lots of resources out there. I highly recommend everything that Rachel Andrew has done. I also really recommend the guides at MDN. Not only are there is there code, reference code about the properties, but there's also some really great guides about progressive enhancement. What do you do about IE? What do you do about accessibility? All the questions that you have are being answered right there at that, on MDN. It really is a time to explore. Tinker Hatfield, a shoe designer for Nike, said, "A basic design is functional. A great one will say something." I really hope we go off and make our layouts say something. Thank you.